She arrived for the divorce with a newborn baby. He was with his mistress, but when he saw the child, he was in shock. Secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. The air conditioning in the law office buzzed with a chill that seemed to penetrate the bones, creating a brutal contrast with the suffocating heat of February in New York. Sarah Johnson gently adjusted the baby in her arms, feeling the warm weight of the small, a body against her chest as she surveyed her surroundings. The mahogany-paneled walls exuded the characteristic scent of wax and power, while gold-framed diplomas hung like trophies from a constant legal battle. The conference room of Thompson and Associates occupied the 20th floor of a commercial building in Midtown Manhattan, its panoramic windows offering a privileged view of the concrete jungle of New York City. At 35, Sarah wore a simple yet well-tailored navy blue dress, a piece she had purchased years earlier when she still believed that expensive clothes were investments for a life that would last forever. Her brown hair was tied in a low bun, revealing the delicate line of her neck and the pearl earrings that had been a wedding gift from her mother-in-law, a bitter irony that she was only just beginning to understand. The baby stirred restlessly, his tiny fists clenched, contrasting with the delicacy of his face. Ethan was only 2 weeks old, but Sarah could already see in him features that intrigued and disturbed her in equal measure. His dark eyes, so different from her own green ones, seemed to carry an impossible wisdom for someone so young. "Sorry for the delay," Sarah said, as the secretary led her into the room, her voice carrying a natural politeness that years of recent humiliation had not completely shaken. The traffic in the South Side was unbearable. It was then that she saw them. David Thompson, her husband of 10 years, was sitting on the opposite side of the conference table, his perfectly manicured hands nervously drumming on the leather of his executive folder. At 42, he maintained the upright posture and impeccable suit he had always worn as armor against the world, but there was something different in his gaze. A restlessness that Sarah could not decipher. Next to him, almost glued to his right arm, was Emily Carter. The 24-year-old looked exactly as Sarah had imagined her during all those sleepless nights of the past few months. Perfectly styled blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, tanned skin suggesting weekends in the Hamptons, and a red dress that cost more than the monthly salary Sarah had earned as a teacher before giving up her career. The engagement ring on her finger was a solitaire diamond of at least 3 carats, capturing the cold light of the air conditioning and reflecting it in small rainbows that danced across the walls. "Sarah," David automatically stood up, a habit of courtesy that years of family upbringing had ingrained in him. His voice carried a tone she knew well, that slightly deeper register he used when he felt uncomfortable but was trying to maintain control of the situation. "David," she replied, her voice firmer than she had expected. "Emily." The young blonde shot her a look that mixed curiosity with something that could be interpreted as pity. Her blue eyes scanned the baby in Sarah's arms with an indescribable expression, as if she were trying to decipher a particularly complex riddle. "So it's true," Emily murmured, more to herself than to the others. "You really had the baby." Sarah felt a pang of something between anger and maternal protection. "Ethan. His name is Ethan." Dr. Smith, a man of about 60 with perfectly styled grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses, gestured for everyone to sit down. His office was a symphony of brown and gold, shelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes, a mahogany table that could easily accommodate 12 people, and paintings of European landscapes suggesting expensive travels and cultivated taste. "Well, Dr." Smith opened a thick folder, its pages carefully organized with colored dividers. Let's begin with the divorce proceedings. As everyone knows, we are here to formalize the separation between Mr. David Thompson and Mrs. Sarah Johnson, as well as to discuss property and custody issues. Sarah adjusted Ethan in her lap, feeling the warm and comforting weight of the baby against her body. The little one was sleeping, his lips slightly parted in an expression of absolute peace that contrasted sharply with the tension hanging over the room. "There are some issues we need to clarify before proceeding," the lawyer continued, his professional tone masking what Sarah suspected was a personal interest in the scandalous nature of the case. Mainly related to the paternity of the child and the legal implications this may have on the division of assets. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. "Dr. Smith, as we discussed over the phone, there are legitimate doubts about..." "Doubts about what exactly?" Sarah interrupted him, her voice taking on a cutting tone that she herself did not expect. "About the fact that you abandoned me when I was 8 months pregnant to move into her apartment, or about the fact that you didn't show up at the hospital when Ethan was born?" Emily shifted in her chair, her face turning a rosy shade that contrasted with her artificial tan. "Sarah, we didn't want it to be this way. Things just happened." "Things just happened," Sarah repeated, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "How interesting. I always thought that extramarital affairs required at least some planning. You must be exceptionally talented to manage to just happen for 2 years." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the air. Conditioning hummed softly, mingling with the distant traffic from the avenue below. Dr. Smith cleared his throat delicately, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Ethan chose that moment to wake up, opening his dark eyes and letting out a small sound that was somewhere between a yawn and a protest. Sarah automatically began to rock him gently, a movement that had become second nature over the past 2 weeks. "He's handsome," Emily suddenly said, her voice carrying an unexpected sincerity. "He has your eyes." Sarah looked at her in surprise, searching for signs of sarcasm or malice, but found only a genuine expression of something she couldn't quite identify. "No," Sarah replied slowly, studying the baby's face. "Actually, he doesn't. His eyes are much darker than mine." David leaned forward as if to say something, but Emily placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but Sarah caught it and mentally filed it away for later analysis. Dr. Smith cleared his throat again, clearly eager to regain control of the meeting. "Well, perhaps it would be best to start with the more practical aspects. Mrs. Sarah, I understand you are currently residing with an aunt?" The question hit Sarah like a slap. The reality of her new situation, a 35-year-old woman with a newborn baby living temporarily in a boarding house in Chinatown, brutally contrasted with the 10 years she had spent as the wife of a successful businessman in the Upper East Side. "Temporarily," she replied, lifting her chin in a gesture of dignity she had learned from her mother. "Until we resolve the issue of our home." "Our home?" David laughed, a humorless sound that echoed uncomfortably in the room. "Sarah, you know very well that—" "That what?" she interrupted him. Again, her voice taking on an intensity that made Ethan squirm restlessly in her arms. "That you sold the house we lived in for 10 years without even telling me? That I found out our house had been sold when the new owners showed up at the door with the keys?" Emily appeared genuinely shocked. "David, you didn't tell me that—" "Emily, please," David interrupted her brusquely, his mask of control beginning to slip. "These are complex legal matters that you resolved without consulting the mother of your child," Sarah finished for him, her voice low but laden with a cold anger that surprised her. Dr. Smith tapped lightly with his pen on the table, a sound that echoed through the room like small hammer blows. Perhaps it would be best to review the documents that have already been signed and see exactly what the current legal situation is. Sarah felt the world begin to spin slightly around her. Signed documents. For years of marriage, David had placed papers in front of her. Contracts, powers of attorney, bank documents. Always with hurried explanations about business matters that she didn't need to worry about. Confident and passionate, she had signed everything without reading, believing they were building a life together. Now, looking at the man she had loved for over a decade, sitting in a cold room with the baby in her arms, while his mistress flaunted a ring that cost more than Sarah would earn in 2 years, she finally began to grasp the true extent of her naivety. Ethan let out another small sound, and Sarah looked down to find the baby's dark eyes fixed on her face, as if he could sense the emotional storm approaching. "It's okay, my love," she murmured to him, her voice taking on a softness that dramatically contrasted with the tension in the room. "Mommy will take care of everything." And in that moment, as the air conditioning continued to hum and the skyscrapers of New York stretched infinitely outside the window, Sarah Johnson made a decision that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone in that room in ways none of them could foresee. The war had begun. Chapter 2. 3 days after the meeting at the law office, Sarah found herself standing at the entrance of the Hope boarding house in the heart of Chinatown with Ethan, asleep in the borrowed stroller and 2 suitcases containing everything that remained of her former life. The 3-story building, painted a faded yellow that had once been cheerful, displayed a wooden sign hanging by rusted chains that creaked softly in the afternoon breeze. "Sarah, my daughter, come in before that boy catches a chill." Aunt Carol's harsh voice echoed down the sidewalk, causing a few curious passers-by to turn and observe the scene. Carol Johnson, Sarah's father's younger sister, was a 68-year-old woman with graying hair always tied in a tight bun and hands calloused from decades of work as a seamstress. Her brown eyes, identical to those that Sarah had inherited from her father, shone with a mix of compassion and practical concern. "Sorry, Aunt Carol," Sarah murmured, pushing the stroller through the narrow door. "I had to wait for the taxi. It's hard to get one that accepts a stroller." The interior of the boarding house was a maze of narrow hallways and wooden stairs that creaked under each step. The characteristic smell of the neighborhood, a mix of oriental spices, frying oil from the restaurants on the street, and the sweet aroma of Japanese sweets, wafted through the open windows, creating an olfactory symphony that Sarah had never experienced during her years in the Upper East Side. "The room I managed to arrange for you is on the 2nd floor," Carol explained, climbing the stairs with an agility that defied her age. "It's not big, but it has a little window that catches the morning sun. It's good for the baby." Sarah followed in silence, pushing the stroller and trying not to think about the irony of climbing creaking stairs, when just a week before she had lived in a single-story house with a garden and pool. The hallway on the 2nd floor was illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent light, creating dancing shadows on the walls covered with floral wallpaper that had seen better days. "Here," Carol stopped in front of a door painted in peeling blue, turning a heavy key in the lock. "Room number 7. It's always been my lucky number." The environment that revealed itself when the door opened was Spartan. A single bed with a handmade crochet blanket, a white-painted wooden dresser with some scratches on the drawers, a straw chair, and a small table pushed against the window. The whole space was no larger than the closet Sarah had in her old home. "I know it's not what you're used to," Carol said, her voice carrying an unusual delicacy. "But it's clean, and you're safe here. No one will disturb you." Sarah placed the stroller next to the bed and sat heavily in the straw chair, which protested softly under her weight. Ethan continued to sleep, oblivious to the dramatic circumstances of his new life. Through the window she could see the constant movement of Main Street. Street vendors shouting offers of pastries and sugarcane juice, hurried pedestrians carrying shopping bags, and the typical organized chaos that characterized that region of New York. "Aunt Carol," Sarah began, her voice weaker than she intended. "I don't know how I'm going to pay." "I don't want to hear that kind of talk," Carol interrupted firmly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Family is family, Sarah. Your father was the only one who helped me when I arrived in New York at 20 with a suitcase of clothes. If it weren't for him, I would never have been able to open my sewing shop." The mention of her father brought a pang of nostalgia to Sarah's chest. Robert Johnson had died 5 years earlier, a victim of a sudden heart attack, without having the chance to meet Ethan or see how the daughter he had raised to be independent had become so dependent on a man who discarded her like an outdated object. "He would be disappointed in me," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to her aunt. "Nonsense!" Carol stepped closer and placed a firm hand on her niece's shoulder. "Robert would be proud to see you fighting for this baby. He would be furious with that idiot David for treating you this way." A soft cry from the stroller interrupted the conversation. Ethan had woken up and was waving his tiny fists in the air, his dark eyes fixed on the ceiling as if trying to decipher the patterns of light and shadow created by the flickering hallway lamp. He must be hungry. Sarah stood up automatically, her maternal instinct still new but already sharpened by 2 weeks of intensive practice. "I'll prepare some tea for you," Carol said, heading for the door. "And then you can tell me exactly what happened at that meeting. From what you told me on the phone, things didn't go as you expected." After Carol left, Sarah picked up Ethan and settled back into the straw chair to nurse him. The familiar motion and the closeness of the baby brought a sense of normalcy amid the chaos of her new reality. While Ethan fed, she watched the frenetic life of Chinatown through the window. Down below, a woman of Asian descent around her age was animatedly chatting with the owner of a pastry stall, gesturing with her hands while he laughed at something she had said. The scene was so simple and natural that Sarah felt a pang of envy. When was the last time she had talked to someone without calculating every word, without worrying about impressions or consequences? A gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Sarah, can I come in?" Carol's voice carried an unusual hesitation. "Of course, Aunt." Carol entered carrying a tray with 2 cups of mint tea and a plate of homemade cookies. Behind her, to Sarah's surprise, came a woman she didn't know. "Sarah, this is Mrs. Hiroko." Carol introduced them with the formality of someone presenting important people. "She has lived here in the boarding house for 5 years and is a retired nurse from the General Hospital." Hiroko Tanaka was approximately 60 years old, with grey hair cut into an elegant bob and eyes that seemed to carry decades of medical wisdom. She wore a navy blue cardigan and impeccably tailored trousers, a discreet elegance that contrasted with the simplicity of the surroundings. "Nice to meet you, Sarah," Hiroko said, her voice carrying a still perceptible Japanese accent after decades in America. "Carol told me about your situation. If you don't mind, I would like to take a look at the baby just to make sure everything is all right." Sarah hesitated for a moment. The idea of letting a stranger examine Ethan awakened her protective instincts, but there was something in Hiroko's demeanor, a calm competence that inspired trust. "He's fine," Sarah said slowly. "The pediatrician at the hospital said everything was normal at birth." "I'm sure he is," Hiroko approached with smooth, calculated movements. "But sometimes it's good to have a second opinion, especially when going through stressful times." Carefully, Sarah transferred Ethan into Hiroko's arms, who received him with the naturalness of someone who had held thousands of babies throughout her career. The retired nurse examined the baby's eyes, ears, and reflexes with a silent efficiency, murmuring reassuring words in Japanese that Ethan seemed to find hypnotic. "He's very beautiful," Hiroko commented after a few minutes. "But there is something I would like to discuss with you. Carol, could you give us a moment?" Carol nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. Sarah felt a wave of anxiety rise in her chest. "What is it? Is there something wrong with him?" Hiroko returned Ethan to Sarah's arms before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Physically, he is perfect, but I notice some characteristics that, well, I would like you to consider getting some tests done." "What kind of characteristics?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying the panic that was beginning to form. "His reflexes are much more developed than normal for 2 weeks, and the auditory response suggests above-average sensitivity. It may be nothing, but it's worth investigating. Besides," Mrs. Hiroko hesitated, "you mentioned that the father is questioning paternity?" Sarah felt her face flush. "David, yes, he is questioning. Sarah-san, it's not my place to say, but as a nurse, I've seen many similar situations. If there's any doubt about paternity, it might be best to resolve it sooner rather than later, for everyone's sake, including Ethan's." The silence that followed was filled with the sounds of the street below and Ethan's soft breathing. Sarah knew Mrs. Hiroko was right, but the idea of subjecting her baby to DNA tests felt like a betrayal, an admission that there was something wrong with the story she had told herself. "Mrs. Hiroko," Sarah finally said, "if I wanted to do these tests, how much would it cost?" Mrs. Hiroko's expression softened. "I know people at the hospital who could help. It wouldn't be free, but it also wouldn't be the price they would charge a private health plan." Sarah nodded slowly, a decision forming in her mind. If David wanted to question Ethan's paternity, she would give him answers, but on her terms, and when she was ready to face the consequences. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Hiroko said gently. "Carol-san told me that you were a literature teacher. It turns out I know someone who might be interested in your services." "What do you mean?" "There's a pediatrician at the hospital where I used to work, Dr. Richard Morales. He's a widower, has a private practice here in Chinatown, and has been trying for months to find someone qualified to give private lessons in Portuguese and literature to immigrants. His clientele is very diverse: Japanese, Korean, Bolivian, Peruvian. Families who want their children to have a more solid Brazilian education." Sarah felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. "Do you think he would be interested?" "I'm sure he would. I can set up a meeting for next week if you want." Ethan chose that moment to emit a small, satisfied sound, as if approving the direction his life was taking. Sarah looked at her son's perfect face and felt something harden inside her, a determination she didn't know she possessed. "Yes," she said firmly. "Set up that meeting." Outside, the afternoon was beginning to darken, and the lights of the restaurants and shops in Chinatown were starting to turn on, creating a kaleidoscope of colors dancing through the window of room number 7. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she had just taken the first step toward a discovery that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her, in ways she could never imagine. For now, though, she simply held her son a little tighter and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, everything would turn out all right in the end. Continue. Chapter 3. The following week passed in a haze of sleepless nights and painful discoveries. Sarah had spent the last 3 days trying to understand the documents that Dr. Smith had mailed, a pile of papers she had signed over the years of marriage, each revealing a new layer of her own naivety. Sitting at the small table in her room, with Ethan sleeping in the stroller beside her and the lamp illuminating the scattered pages, Sarah felt as if she were dismantling her own life, piece by piece. The power of attorney she had signed in 2019, thinking it was just to facilitate the purchase of equipment for David's business. The document from 2021 that transferred her share of the house to a corporate holding for tax purposes. The authorization from 2023 that allowed the sale of real estate without her physical presence. Foolish, she murmured to herself, running her hand through her disheveled hair. How could I have been so foolish? A soft knock on the door pulled her from her dark thoughts. "Sarah, it's Mrs. Hiroko. May I come in?" "Of course." Sarah hurried to gather the documents, trying to hide the evidence of her self-inflicted humiliation. Mrs. Hiroko entered carrying a tray with tea and cookies, but her expression was more serious than usual. "How are you feeling today?" "Like an idiot who signed her own financial death warrant," Sarah replied with more honesty than she intended. The retired nurse placed the tray on the table and sat in the wicker chair. "Sarah-san, may I speak frankly?" "Please. During my 40 years as a nurse, I have seen many women in situations similar to yours. Intelligent, educated women who made choices that seemed right at the time but turned out to be disastrous later." Mrs. Hiroko paused to pour the tea. "The difference between those who managed to rebuild their lives and those who didn't wasn't education, money, or even luck. It was the ability to forgive themselves for the past and focus on the future." Sarah accepted the teacup, feeling the warm steam against her face. It's easy to talk about forgiving oneself when you haven't lost everything because of your own stupidity. "You haven't lost everything," Mrs. Hiroko said firmly. "You have Ethan, you have your education, you have your youth and your health, and this afternoon you have an interview with Dr. Morales." Sarah almost dropped the cup. "Today? You didn't say it would be this week." "Plans changed. He had a cancellation and wants to meet you today at 3 in the afternoon. The office is on Student Street, 10 minutes walking from here." Panic began to form in Sarah's stomach. "But I'm not prepared. I don't even know what he wants. I don't have an updated resume, and—" She gestured vaguely. "How am I going to explain that I have a 3-week-old baby?" Sarah," Mrs. Hiroko leaned forward, her eyes conveying an unwavering calm. "Dr. David Thompson has been a widower for 3 years. His wife passed away from cancer, leaving him with an 8-year-old son. He understands more about real-life challenges than any curriculum could demonstrate." At 2:45 in the afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in front of a medical office that occupied the ground floor of a residential building on Student Street. The golden plaque on the door announced Dr. David Thompson, Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, in elegant letters. Through the large windows she could see a waiting room decorated in cheerful colors and child-friendly furniture. Ethan was quiet in the stroller, his dark eyes watching the leaves dance in the afternoon breeze. Sarah had chosen her best dress, a navy blue one that still fit well despite her recent bodily changes, and tried to hide the dark circles under her eyes with the makeup that remained from her previous life. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with grey hair and a warm smile, greeted her with professional efficiency tempered by genuine kindness. "You must be Mrs. Sarah Johnson. Dr. Thompson is expecting you. Please feel free to leave the stroller here at the reception if you prefer." "Actually, I would prefer to take him with me," Sarah said, feeling slightly ridiculous. "He's still too small to be left alone." "Of course, no problem. The doctor's office is quite spacious." Sarah was led down a corridor decorated with children's drawings and photographs of landscapes suggesting travels around the world. The office door was open, revealing an environment that managed to be both professional and welcoming at the same time. Dr. David Thompson stood up when she entered, and Sarah felt a small surprise. From Mrs. Hiroko's descriptions, she had imagined an older man, but David seemed to be at most 38 years old. Tall, dark-haired, with slightly wavy dark hair and brown eyes that conveyed a natural seriousness tempered by smile lines, suggesting an ease with smiling. "Mrs. Sarah, it's a pleasure." He extended his hand, and she noticed that his fingers were long and delicate, hands of a doctor, but also of someone who played piano or drew. "Mrs. Hiroko told me a lot about you. Please, have a seat." "And this must be Ethan." "Yes." Sarah settled into the offered chair, maneuvering the stroller into a position where she could see the baby. "I hope you don't mind my situation. I know it's a bit unprofessional to bring a child to a job interview." David smiled, and Sarah noted that Mrs. Hiroko was right. There was a genuine understanding in his eyes. "Mrs. Sarah, I have an 8-year-old son. Believe me, I completely understand the challenges of balancing parental responsibilities with professional life." The relief that Sarah felt was almost physical. "Mrs. Hiroko explained that you are looking for someone to give private lessons in Portuguese and literature." "Exactly. My clientele is very diverse. Immigrant families from various nationalities who want their children to master not only colloquial Portuguese, but also to have a deeper understanding of Brazilian literature and culture." David leaned back in his chair, his fingers gently drumming on the table. "The challenge is finding someone with a solid academic background who also has cultural sensitivity to work with children and teenagers from very different backgrounds. May I ask what kind of nationalities?" "Mainly Japanese, Korean, and Chinese families that have settled here in the neighborhood, but also Bolivians, Peruvians, and Argentinians. There are some Syrian and Lebanese families as well. The challenge is not just the language, but helping these children navigate between their home culture and Brazilian culture." Sarah felt a spark of genuine interest. "Actually, that sounds fascinating. During my years as a teacher, I was always interested in how literature can serve as a bridge between different cultures." "Mrs. Hiroko mentioned that you have a degree in literature from a university?" "Yes, with a specialization in Brazilian literature. I worked for 5 years in private schools before—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Before focusing on family life?" David nodded, not pressing her for details. "And how do you envision structuring a teaching program for this type of clientele?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling for the first time in weeks that she was on familiar ground. "Well, I believe that Brazilian literature offers an incredible wealth for understanding our culture. I would start with authors like Monteiro Lobato for younger children. The stories from the Yellow Woodpecker Ranch are universally understandable but also deeply Brazilian. For older students, perhaps Machado de Assis, but historically contextualized. And I would definitely include contemporary authors like Conceição Evaristo and Milton Hatum, who address issues of identity and belonging that these children could relate to their own experiences." As Sarah spoke, she noticed that David leaned forward, his eyes shining with interest. Ethan chose that moment to wake up and emit a small sound, not exactly a cry, but a soft protest against the world. "Excuse me." Sarah leaned in to check on Ethan, automatically switching to mom mode. "Please feel free," David said. "Actually, if you don't mind me asking, how old is he exactly?" 3 weeks today." David stood up and approached the stroller, his hands already moving, in the familiar pattern of a pediatrician examining a child. "May I?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment before agreeing. David picked up Ethan with the natural competence of someone who had held thousands of babies, but there was something more in his movements, a delicacy almost reverent that suggested personal experience with fatherhood. "He's beautiful," David murmured, discreetly examining Ethan's reflexes and responses. "And very alert for 3 weeks. His eyes are unusual." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, a twinge of anxiety coloring her voice. "Not in a bad way," David hurried to reassure her. "It's just that the color is very distinct for a baby. A newborn baby. It usually takes a few months for the eyes to acquire their final color." He handed Ethan back to Sarah, but she noticed that his hands lingered a bit longer than necessary during the transfer, his fingers briefly touching hers. "Mrs. Sarah," David said, returning to his chair but maintaining a more informal posture, "I would really like to offer you the position. The hours would be flexible, mainly afternoons and weekends when the kids are not in school. Payment would be per session, and I could arrange a space here in the office for the sessions if that would make transportation easier with Ethan." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Dr. Thompson, I don't know how to thank you, but I need to be honest about my situation. I'm going through a complicated divorce, temporarily living with my aunt, and—" She took a deep breath. "There are some legal issues related to Ethan's custody that could become public. I don't want this to reflect negatively on you or your practice." David studied her for a long moment, his eyes conveying an understanding that went beyond professional sympathy. "Mrs. Sarah, can I tell you something? My wife passed away 3 years ago after a 2-year battle with cancer. During that time, I lost count of how many times I had to take my son David to professional meetings, medical appointments, even to the hospital when she was admitted. Real life doesn't wait for convenient moments to happen." Sarah couldn't hold back the tears that began to roll down her cheeks. "Moreover," David continued gently, "Ethan will need regular pediatric follow-ups. If you wouldn't mind, I would like to be his pediatrician. No charge, of course. It would be a professional courtesy." "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you being so kind to me?" David smiled, but there was an old sadness in his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be alone with a small child and feel like the whole world has collapsed. And because I believe people deserve second chances, especially when they are struggling to rebuild their lives." Ethan chose that moment to let out a small, satisfied sound, as if approving the direction of the conversation. Sarah looked at her son's perfect little face and then back at David, feeling something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the sensation that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in the world. "When can I start?" she asked. "How about next Monday? I have 3 families eager to start lessons." When Sarah left David's office an hour later with a work contract in her bag and a lesson plan scribbled in a borrowed notebook, she felt lighter than she had in months. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the sycamores lining Student Street, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced over Ethan's stroller. For the first time since David had left home, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe she could rebuild her life. She didn't yet know that her meeting with Dr. David Thompson would initiate a series of discoveries that would transform not only her understanding of her own future, but also of her past, including secrets about Ethan that would change everything she thought she knew about who the true protagonists of her own story were. Continue Ear 36, Chapter 4. 2 weeks after starting to work in David's office, Sarah had established a routine that, for the first time in months, gave her the feeling of having some control over her life. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning, she walked the 10 minutes from the boarding house to Student Street, with Ethan in the stroller, to give private lessons in the meeting room that David had adapted as an improvised classroom. On this specific March morning, as the autumn in New York began to paint the leaves with golden hues, Sarah prepared to welcome her 3 regular students. Lily Johnson, a 12-year-old Japanese girl whose family had moved to the U.S. 2 years ago. David Thompson Jr., David's 8-year-old son, and Lucy Chen, a 15-year-old Chinese teenager who spoke Portuguese fluently but struggled with the nuances of American literature. "Good morning, Teacher Sarah," Lily entered the room carrying a bright pink backpack and a smile that lit up her round face. Her black hair was tied in 2 braids adorned with colourful ribbons, and she wore the immaculate uniform of the private school she attended. "Good morning, Lily," Sarah replied, using the affectionate Japanese suffix she had learned from Mrs. Hiroko. "How was your weekend?" "My mom made dumplings for the school festival, but no one wanted to try them because they said octopus is gross," Lily reported with the brutal honesty of children. "I told them that in America you eat sausage, which is made from pig intestines, but they said it's different." Sarah smiled, recognizing a teaching opportunity. "That reminds me of a story by Mark Twain about different cultures. How about we read today about how little Nellie explains the differences between countries?" David arrived shortly after, his brown hair tousled, suggesting he had run from elementary school to get there. At 8 years old, he had his father's dark eyes, but an energetic restlessness that contrasted with David's natural serenity. "Aunt Sarah, my dad said you have a baby," David announced without preamble, flopping into the chair with the grace of a sack of potatoes. "Where is he?" "Ethan is sleeping in your dad's office," Sarah explained patiently. Over the past 15 days, she had developed an arrangement with David. During lessons, he would stay with Ethan in his office, allowing her to focus completely on teaching. "Would you like to meet him after class?" David's eyes lit up. "Of course! I've never seen a real baby, only in the movies." Lucy entered, quietly, as she always did, carrying a stack of books that seemed disproportionate to her slender frame. At 15, she had the precocious seriousness of someone who had taken on adult responsibilities far too early. Sarah had discovered that Lucy translated official documents for her parents, who spoke only Mandarin. "Sorry for being late, teacher," Lucy murmured in perfect but slightly formal English for a teenager. "I had to help my mom at the restaurant this morning." "No problem, Lucy. In fact, you arrived at the perfect time. Today we're going to do something different." Sarah walked to the whiteboard that David had installed on the wall and wrote 3 words: identity, belonging, and family. "I want each of you to tell me a story about a moment when you felt different from others, and then we'll see how that connects with what we're reading in American literature." Lily raised her hand immediately, her natural energy unable to contain her desire to participate. "I can start. On my first day of school here in America, I brought a lunchbox for snack," she began, gesturing animatedly. "Everyone stared at my food like it was alien. A girl asked why I didn't bring a normal sandwich like normal people." "And how did you feel?" Sarah asked gently. "Like I was wrong," Lily admitted, her voice losing some of its enthusiasm. "Like to be American, I had to stop being Japanese." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I feel that way sometimes too, but it's different." "How is it different, Ethan?" "Well, everyone at school has a mom and dad, and I only have a dad. When Mother's Day comes, I don't know what to do. Last year I made a card for my grandmother, but it's not the same." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. Ethan's loss of his mother was something that David rarely mentioned, but she could see how it affected the boy at unexpected moments. "Lucy, would you like to share something?" Sarah asked softly. The teenager hesitated for a long moment, her fingers nervously playing with the cover of one of the books. "At school, the other students always ask me to help with math because they think all Chinese people are math geniuses," she finally said. "But I'm terrible at math. My strength is words, stories. When I tell them that, they look disappointed, like I'm a defective Chinese." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep connection with her students' experiences. "You know, there's an American author named Mark Twain who wrote about exactly this. About being different, about belonging to more than one culture at the same time, about how families can be different from what we expect." She walked to the shelf and picked up a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Twain was of Lebanese descent, but was born in the Midwest. He wrote about characters who, like you, had to figure out how to be American without losing their own cultural identity. Is that possible? Lily asked, with a sincerity that touched Sarah's heart. Not only is it possible, but it's one of the most beautiful things about America, Sarah replied, feeling more like a teacher than she had in years. Our country was built by people from all corners of the world who brought their cultures and mixed them with what already existed here. Ethan raised his hand. But what if your family is different? Not because of country, but because of other things. Sarah knelt down to be at eye level with the boy. Ethan, families come in all shapes and sizes. Some have a mum and dad, some only have a dad, some only have a mum, some have grandparents, uncles, or people we choose to be our family. What makes a family special isn't how it looks, but how the people love and care for each other. A soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. David appeared in the doorway, carrying Ethan in his arms. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, but Sarah noticed that his eyes sparkled with something that looked like pride. Ethan woke up and was looking for Mommy. "Dad!" Ethan jumped out of his chair. "You brought the baby!" Sarah stepped forward to take Ethan, but noticed that David seemed reluctant to hand him over. During the 2 weeks of working together, she had observed how he interacted with Ethan, always professional, always careful. But there were moments like this when she sensed something more personal in his actions. "He's so small!" Lily exclaimed, stepping closer with the respectful curiosity of well-mannered children. "Can I touch his little hand?" "Of course, but gently," Sarah instructed, watching as Lily gently touched Ethan's tiny fingers. "Teacher Sarah," Lucy said thoughtfully, "Ethan will also have to figure out his identity when he grows up, right? I mean, with everything that's happening with his parents." The question hit Sarah like a punch in the stomach. She had managed, over the past few weeks, to create a bubble of normalcy around her new life, almost forgetting the legal and emotional complications that still awaited her. "Lucy is right," David said softly, his eyes meeting Sarah's over Ethan's head. "But one of the beautiful things about children is that they are resilient. With love and support, they can overcome almost any challenge." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Not anxiety this time, but something warmer and more complicated. The way David looked at Ethan, the natural ease with which he had inserted himself into their little makeshift family, the kindness with which he treated not only her, but also the complexities of their situation. "You know what?" Sarah said, inspired by a sudden impulse. "How about we read a story today about unconventional families? I have a collection here with a story. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful story about a boy raised by his grandmother who discovers that family is not just about DNA, but about who is there for you when you need them." As she flipped through the book, searching for the right story, Ethan emitted a small, satisfied sound, as if approving the direction of the conversation. David remained in the room, leaning against the wall, watching Sarah teach, with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. "Here," Sarah found the page she was looking for. "This tale is by Conceição Evaristo and is called Maria. It tells the story of a woman who works as a domestic worker and has to leave her son with a neighbor while she works. It's a story about sacrifice, but also about how love can exist in imperfect situations." As Sarah began to read, her voice took on the rhythm and cadence she always used when teaching, a musicality that transformed words into lived experiences. She noticed that David had moved closer, seemingly hypnotized, not just by the story, but by the way she told it. When she finished reading, the room was in complete silence. Lily's eyes were misty, David Jr. was curled up, hugging his knees in a defensive position, and Lucy was watching Sarah with an almost adult intensity. "Teacher," Lily finally said, "the mother in the story. Does she love her son, even though she can't be with him all the time?" What do you think, Lily? I think so. I think that sometimes loving someone means doing hard things so they can have a better life. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Exactly. And you all? Have you ever felt that kind of love in your lives? David Jr. slowly raised his hand. My dad. He works a lot so I can have everything I need even when he's tired, and sometimes I hear him crying in his room at night, but in the morning he always smiles at me. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Sarah looked at David and saw that his eyes were shining, his jaw slightly tense with the effort of controlling his own emotions. You know, Sarah said softly, I think this was our best class so far. You all understood something very important about literature and about life, that the best stories are the ones that help us understand our own feelings and experiences. When the class ended and the children left, Lily promising to bring dumplings for Sarah to try, David Jr. asking to see Ethan again next time, and Lucy carrying a list of recommended books, Sarah and David found themselves alone in the makeshift classroom, with Ethan sleeping peacefully in the stroller. Sarah, David said gently, you are an extraordinary teacher. Thank you, she replied, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks. They are special students. They remind me why I love teaching. Can I ask you something? Sarah nodded. In the story you read, were you thinking about your own situation? The question was gentle, but Sarah felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. Maybe, she admitted. Sometimes I wonder if the choices I'm making now are the best for Ethan. If fighting for my independence is worth it, if it means he will grow up with less financial stability, or if... Sarah. David stepped closer, his voice carrying a gentle firmness. You are giving Ethan something money can't buy. The example of a strong mother who fights for what she believes in. That is worth more than any bank account. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with an intimacy that went beyond the professional relationship they had established. Sarah could smell the subtle scent of David's cologne, a clean and masculine fragrance that reminded her of safety and stability. Ethan chose that moment to wake up, opening his dark eyes and fixing them directly on David, as if he could sense the tension in the air around him. Hello, little one, David murmured, automatically extending a finger for Ethan to hold. How was literature class today? Sarah watched the interaction between David and her son, noticing once again the natural way they connected. There was something there she couldn't name, a familiarity that went beyond the doctor-patient relationship, or even the growing friendship between her and David. David, she said impulsively, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you miss having a complete family for David Jr.? David paused, his fingers still intertwined with Ethan's. Every day, he finally admitted. But I've learned that family is not just about traditional structure. It's about people who care for each other, who are there in tough times, who do their best to protect one another. He looked directly at her, like what you are doing right now. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a complex emotion that was part gratitude, part attraction, and part fear of raising expectations that could prove false. Sarah, David said softly, would you like to have dinner with me and David Jr. this weekend? Nothing formal, just friends having dinner together. The question hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities and complications. Sarah looked at Ethan, who continued to hold David's finger as if it were the most natural thing in the world, then at the man who had become both her employer and something she wasn't prepared to define. I would love to, she heard her own voice say before her rational mind could intervene, and in that moment, as the March afternoon sun filtered through the window of the makeshift classroom, Sarah didn't know she had just accepted more than a simple dinner. She had just taken the first step toward discoveries that would reveal not only the true feelings between her and David, but also secrets about Ethan that would completely transform her understanding of who he really was, and who she herself was becoming. Chapter 5. Dinner at Ricardo's house was set for Saturday at 7 in the evening, but Sarah arrived 15 minutes late because Ethan had chosen that exact moment to have a crying fit that nothing seemed to soothe. When she finally rang the doorbell of the 2-story brownstone in Brooklyn, her nerves were on edge, and she felt like a teenager on her first date. Ricardo's house was a 1940s construction that had been carefully restored, maintaining its original charm while incorporating modern amenities. The brick facade was covered by a vine that was beginning to yellow with the arrival of autumn, and small lights hanging on the porch created a cozy atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the cold modernity of the apartment Sarah had shared with David. "Sarah, you made it!" Diego opened the door before she could ring the bell a second time, his contagious energy immediately filling the entryway. "Dad, she brought the baby!" Ricardo appeared behind his son, drying his hands on a kitchen towel and wearing an apron that declared, "The chef is always guilty," a gift clearly chosen by a child. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a tomato sauce stain on his shirt, details that somehow made him even more attractive in Sarah's eyes. "Sorry for the delay," Sarah said, adjusting Ethan in the stroller. "He decided to have a meltdown right as we were leaving." "Babies have perfect timing for that sort of thing," Ricardo laughed, gesturing for her to come in. "Diego, help Aunt Sarah with the stroller." The interior of the house was a harmonious blend of comfort and functionality. The living room had well-worn brown leather sofas, shelves filled with medical books mixed with children's literature, and family photographs that Sarah tried not to examine too closely. The aroma wafting from the kitchen was a tempting combination of garlic, tomatoes, and basil that made her stomach growl. She had forgotten to have lunch in her anxiety to prepare for the evening. "I hope you like lasagna," Ricardo said, leading her through the house. "It's one of the few things I know how to make well, and Diego approves." "I love lasagna," Diego announced, as if it were a personal achievement. "Dad learned to make it after Mommy, well, after. Before that, we only ate frozen pizza." Sarah noticed how Ricardo made an almost imperceptible grimace at the casual mention of his late wife, but he quickly recovered. The kitchen was Sarah's territory, Ricardo explained, leading them to a dining room that opened directly into an American-style kitchen. "I had to learn to cook out of necessity, but I found it relaxing, especially after tough days at the office." The table was set for 3, with a place clearly adapted for Diego, a cup with a straw, extra napkins, and a chair with a cushion to adjust the height. There was also an empty space next to Sarah's chair, where Ethan's stroller would fit perfectly, a thoughtful detail that touched her more than she expected. "Can I hold the baby?" Diego asked, his eyes shining with curiosity as Sarah settled in. "Of course, but it has to be sitting on the sofa," Sarah instructed, noticing how Ricardo instinctively moved closer to supervise the interaction. As Diego settled onto the living room sofa, arms carefully positioned as Sarah had demonstrated, Ethan was transferred into his arms with the seriousness of someone receiving a national treasure. "He's so light," Diego murmured, completely absorbed by the presence of the baby. "And look how he's looking at me. It's like he knows me." Sarah and Ricardo exchanged a glance over Diego's head, a moment of shared parental connection that hit her with an unexpected intensity. For a moment, she could imagine what it would be like if this were truly her family, if this cozy house were her home, if Ricardo were... "Sarah?" Ricardo's voice brought her back to reality. "Would you like some wine? I have a Merlot that goes well with the lasagna." "That would be great." she replied, grateful to have something to do with her hands besides nervously twisting her fingers. The lasagna was delicious, perfect layers of pasta, meat and cheese that melted in her mouth. Diego kept up an animated conversation about school, soccer, and his growing obsession with dinosaurs, while Ricardo poured the wine and discreetly observed Sarah over his own glass. "Aunt Sarah," Diego suddenly said, "are you going to get married again?" Sarah nearly choked on her wine. "Diego!" "What kind of question is that?" Ricardo gently reprimanded his son. "It's just that at school, the teacher said that when parents get divorced, sometimes they marry other people and the kids get new siblings," Diego explained with the relentless logic of childhood. "And Ethan needs a dad, right?" The silence that followed was laden with embarrassment and unspoken possibilities. Sarah felt her face heat up, while Ricardo focused intently on cutting the lasagna as if it were delicate surgery. "Diego," Sarah finally said, "those are very complicated questions for adults. For now, I'm focused on taking good care of Ethan and rebuilding my life." "But would you like to get married again?" Diego persisted with the determination of an 8-year-old private investigator. "Diego, that's enough," Ricardo said more firmly. "Those are very personal questions." "That's okay," Sarah said softly, lightly touching Ricardo's arm. "He's just curious." She turned to Diego. "You know, Diego, after we go through tough things in life, we need time to heal before making big decisions. It's like when you get hurt playing. You don't run out again until you're sure you're better." Diego nodded solemnly, as if processing important information. "That makes sense. Dad took a long time after Mommy died to stop crying at night. This time it was David Jr. who nearly choked, his face turning a shade of red. Ethan. But now he doesn't cry anymore," David Jr. continued, oblivious to his father's discomfort. "Especially since you started working with him, Aunt. Sarah, he's happier." Sarah felt her heart race. She looked at David, who was intensely studying his plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Is that true?" she asked softly. David slowly lifted his eyes, and Sarah saw a vulnerability in them that he usually kept hidden behind his professional competence. "Yes," he admitted, "it's true." The moment was interrupted by Ethan, who began to fidget in the stroller. Sarah automatically stood up to check on him, but David beat her to it. "Let me see," he said, his medical instincts taking over. He picked up Ethan with the familiarity of weeks of practice, holding him against his chest and making soft, soothing sounds. Sarah watched the scene, David gently rocking his son, while David Jr. looked on with admiration, and felt something break inside her. Not from pain this time, but from a sudden and frightening realization. She was falling in love, not just with David, but with that life, with that possibility of family she had never considered before. "Sarah," David said softly, still rocking Ethan, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Does Ethan's biological father know he exists?" The question hit Sarah like a bucket of cold water. During the last few weeks of relative normalcy, she had managed to avoid thinking about the complications that still awaited her. The divorce process, the DNA tests, and the identity of Ethan's true father. "It's complicated," she finally said. "More complicated than David questioning paternity?" Sarah took a deep breath, making a decision she knew was risky. "David, there are things about my situation that I haven't told you. About Ethan, about the divorce, about—" "Sarah," David gently interrupted her, "you don't owe me explanations. Your personal life is your personal life." "No, you need to know," Sarah insisted, feeling she had passed the point where she could keep secrets. If this between us is going to develop in any direction, you need to know the truth." David Jr. had sensed the change in atmosphere and was watching the adults with the keen intuition of children who grew up dealing with difficult conversations. "David Jr.," David said softly, "how about you take Ethan to your room and show him your dinosaurs? We'll talk here for a few minutes." "Adult conversations?" David Jr. asked resignedly. "Adult conversations." After David Jr. left, carefully carrying Ethan, as if he were fine crystal, Sarah and David were left alone in the dining room. The silence stretched for a few moments, filled only by the distant sound of traffic from Brooklyn and David Jr.'s voice talking to Ethan upstairs. "Ethan may not be David's son," Sarah finally said, the words spilling out in a rush before she lost her courage. "In fact, I'm almost sure he isn't." David said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "During the last year of my marriage, David and I were practically separated. He traveled constantly, and when he was home, well, it was already obvious there was someone else. One night, after a particularly ugly fight, I left home and—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I made a choice I'm not proud of. I was with someone." "Just once?" David asked, no judgment in his voice. "Just once. And now, looking at Ethan, seeing how he develops, his features—" Sarah took a deep breath. "I think I know who the true father is. Have you told that person?" "No. And that's the complicated part. He doesn't know Ethan exists, and revealing paternity will complicate everything. The divorce, custody, the financial situation." David leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "Sarah, can I ask a medical question?" She nodded. "Would you like me to request a discreet DNA test? Just so you can be sure. It doesn't have to be legal, just for your own knowledge." The offer was tempting, but Sarah hesitated. "What if I'm not ready for the consequences of the truth?" "Then you don't have to do anything with the information until you're ready," David said simply. "But knowledge is power, Sarah, especially when it comes to protecting your son." Ethan chose that moment to let out a protest cry from David Jr.'s room, followed by a worried exclamation from the boy. "Aunt Sarah, he's crying!" They quickly ascended the stairs, finding David Jr. trying to calm Ethan with a heartfelt but ineffective dedication. "He must be hungry," Sarah said, taking the baby in her arms. "Sorry, I should have brought a bottle." "You can breastfeed here," David said naturally. "David Jr., let's give Aunt Sarah some privacy." "Actually," Sarah said impulsively, "you guys can stay. David Jr. is almost family now, right?" The choice of words seemed to resonate in the room. David Jr. beamed. David looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her blush, and Ethan calmed down as if he knew he was in the right place. As Sarah settled into the armchair in David Jr.'s room to breastfeed Ethan, watching David explain to his son about the importance of child nutrition, she realized she had made a decision without realizing it, not just about trusting David with her secrets, but about allowing herself to imagine a future different from the one she had planned. "David," she said softly, "about that DNA test." "Yes? I would like to do it, but when I'm ready to deal with the consequences." David nodded. "Whenever you want." In that moment, with Ethan feeding peacefully in her arms, David Jr. whispering questions about babies to his father, and the feeling of being in a home where she was truly welcome, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life was finally starting to head in the right direction. She didn't know. Even though the consequences of her decision regarding the DNA test would reveal not only the identity of Gabriel's father, but also the beginning of a series of discoveries that would completely transform her understanding of who she really was and what the true game being played around her had been all those years. For now, however, she simply held her son a little tighter and allowed herself to enjoy the feeling of being at home. Continue. 2:42. Chapter 6. 3 weeks after dinner at David's house, Sarah found herself standing at the entrance of the General Hospital at 7 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in April, with Gabriel sleeping in the stroller and a sealed envelope in her bag containing the DNA test results. David had managed to get the test through a discreet contact at the lab, and now she held in her hands the answer to a question that would change the course of her life. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay with you when you open it?" David asked for the third time, adjusting his white coat as he prepared for his morning rounds. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I need to process this on my own first." "I understand. But Sarah," he gently touched her arm, "regardless of what that paper says, nothing changes between us. You know that, right?" She nodded, but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The result of that test could change everything: her legal situation, her relationship with David, and especially her growing closeness with him. Sarah spent the morning wandering the streets of Chinatown with Gabriel, the envelope burning in her bag as if it were radioactive. She stopped at a cafe on Main Street, ordered a cappuccino that she barely touched, and finally, sitting at a corner table with Gabriel sleeping beside her, she opened the envelope. The technical terms seemed to dance before her eyes, but the conclusion was clear and devastating. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. David Thompson is excluded as the biological father of Gabriel Johnson. Sarah felt the world spin around her. She had suspected, but having the confirmation in writing made everything brutally real. Gabriel was not David's son. This meant her legal situation had become infinitely more complicated, and that she would have to reveal the identity of the true father much sooner than she had planned. Her phone vibrated with a text message. "David. Sarah, we need to talk. Urgent. We received a proposal that could resolve our situation amicably." Sarah frowned. Since the meeting at the lawyer's office, David had communicated exclusively through Dr. Smith. Direct contact suggested something significant had changed. She replied, "What kind of proposal?" The response came immediately. "I can't explain over text. Can you come to the office this afternoon, 3 p.m.? Sarah looked at Gabriel, who chose that moment to open his eyes and stare at her with those dark eyes that she now knew for sure did not come from David. The truth was there, in her son's little face, waiting to be revealed. "Okay, I'll be there." Dr. Smith's office at 3 in the afternoon was substantially different from the first time Sarah had been there. The formal atmosphere had been replaced by an almost palpable tension, and David looked visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he greeted Sarah. "Where's Emily?" Sarah asked, noticing the absence of the young blonde. "She couldn't come today," David replied, avoiding her gaze. Dr. Smith cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sarah, your husband, ex-husband, has brought a proposal that we believe would be beneficial for both parties." "What kind of proposal?" David leaned forward, his words coming out in a nervous rush. "Sarah, the company is facing some issues, serious issues. There's an ongoing audit, and some irregularities have been discovered." "What kind of irregularities?" Sarah asked, feeling Gabriel squirm restlessly in her arms. "Irregularities that I didn't know existed," David insisted. "It seems someone was using the company for activities that I never authorized." Dr. Smith opened a thick folder. "What Mr. David is trying to explain is that there is evidence that third parties used his company for money laundering without his knowledge. The IRS is investigating, and there is a real possibility that all assets will be frozen." Sarah felt a chill in her stomach. "What does this have to do with me?" "If the assets are frozen, you won't receive anything in the divorce," David explained quickly. "But if we reach an agreement now, before that happens, I can transfer some assets to you. A substantial amount that would secure your future and Gabriel's. In exchange for what? David and Dr. Smith exchanged a meaningful glance. In exchange for you to drop any questioning about Gabriel's paternity and accept that he is not my biological son. Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. How do you know about paternity questions? I never said I had doubts. Sarah, David said gently, we both know there are irregularities with the dates. Gabriel was born exactly 9 months after that fight we had in June last year, when you left home and didn't come back for 3 days. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heart beating, could feel Gabriel breathing against her chest, could see David waiting for her response with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. And if I don't accept, then you'll be involved in the IRS investigation as the wife of a businessman suspected of money laundering. Your assets could also be frozen. You might have trouble finding work, renting an apartment. Dr. Smith left the implications hanging in the air. But Sarah, David rushed to add, if you accept, I'll transfer $2 million to an account in your name today. Enough money for you to start over, raise Gabriel with dignity, maybe even go back to school. $2 million. The amount echoed in Sarah's mind like a bell. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her life, enough to secure Ethan's future, to never depend on anyone again. Why are you offering this? She asked slowly. What do you gain from my acceptance? David hesitated. It simplifies things, for everyone. There was something in his answer that didn't sound true. But before Sarah could question further, her phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. Don't accept the offer. There's more at stake than you realize. Meet me at Central Park today at 6 p.m. near the lake. I will come alone. Emily. Sarah looked at David, who was watching her anxiously, and then at Dr. Smith, who was studying some papers with exaggerated concentration. I need to think, she finally said. It's a very important decision to make under pressure. Of course, but Sarah, we can't leave this offer open indefinitely, Dr. Smith said. Circumstances are changing rapidly. You would have until tomorrow noon to decide. When Sarah left the office an hour later, her mind was swirling with questions. The offer was too tempting to be true, and Emily's message suggested that there was information she did not possess. More intriguing still, why was David's mistress trying to help her? At 6 in the evening, Sarah found herself sitting on a bench near the lake in Central Park, with Ethan sleeping in the stroller beside her. The park was bustling with people exercising after work, families strolling with children, and couples enjoying the late afternoon. Emily appeared promptly at 6, but the confident young woman Sarah had met in the lawyer's office had been replaced by someone visibly nervous. She wore sunglasses despite the sun setting and constantly looked over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Sarah, she said, sitting down on the bench beside her, thank you for coming. Emily, what's going on? Why did you send me that message? The young woman took a deep breath, removing her sunglasses to reveal red eyes from recent crying. Sarah, there are things about David, about his company, about our relationship that you don't know. Things that will change everything. Like what? To start, I am not who David thinks I am. Emily paused as if making an irreversible decision. My real name is Emily Johnson. Sarah felt the world begin to spin. Johnson. Sarah, I am your daughter. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of the wind in the leaves and distant traffic. Sarah looked at the young woman beside her, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the bone structure, searching for similarities that could confirm or deny the impossible statement. This is impossible, Sarah murmured. I never had a daughter. You did. And you gave me up for adoption when you were 16, Emily said gently. It was your parents who arranged everything, told you that the baby had been stillborn. But I survived, Sarah, and I grew up looking for you." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Fragments of long-buried memories began to emerge. The pregnancy at 16, the traumatic birth, her parents saying the baby hadn't survived, the funeral without a body that she had been forced to accept. "You're lying," Sarah whispered. But even as she said the words, she knew Emily was telling the truth. "Sarah, there's a reason I got close to David. It wasn't a coincidence. I'd been investigating you for months when I discovered that you were married. I thought that by getting close to him, I could understand why my biological mother had abandoned me." Ethan chose that moment to wake up, making small sounds that caused Emily to turn and look at him. When her eyes landed on the baby, her expression changed completely. "Oh my God," she whispered, "he has your eyes. The same eyes I saw in the mirror as a child, before I started wearing colored contact lenses." Sarah looked from Ethan to Emily, searching for the similarities that now seemed obvious: the shape of the nose, the curve of the lips, the form of the eyebrows. "Emily," Sarah said with a trembling voice, "if you are my daughter, why are you with David? Why are you doing this to me?" "Because initially I wanted to get revenge on you. I wanted to destroy your life as you had destroyed mine," Emily admitted, tears beginning to stream down her face. "But then I spent months watching you, seeing how David treated you, seeing how you were kind, and I began to suspect that maybe you didn't know the truth about what happened to me." Sarah felt her own tears beginning to fall. "I thought you had died. My parents told me. They made me believe. They sold me to a wealthy family that couldn't have children," Emily said bitterly. "I grew up with everything money could buy, but never knowing who I really was." "But why are you telling me this now? Why did you warn me not to accept David's offer?" Emily leaned in closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Because during the months I spent with David, I discovered that he is involved in much worse things than money laundering. And Sarah, he knows who I really am. He always has." Sarah felt as if the bench was moving beneath her. "What do you mean?" "David knew I was your daughter even before he met me. Our relationship, my appearance in his life, everything was orchestrated by him." Emily paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "Sarah, you need to know the truth about Ethan too." "What about Ethan?" Emily looked directly at her, her words carrying a weight that would change everything. "He is not just not David's son. Ethan is the son of Dr. David Thompson, and David knows that too." Sarah's world completely collapsed at that moment. Everything. The revelation from Emily echoed in Sarah's mind throughout the night. She returned to the boarding house in shock, barely able to respond to Aunt Carol's concerned questions about her day. Now at 5 in the morning on Wednesday, she was sitting in the wicker chair of room number 7, watching Gabriel sleep in the stroller while processing the magnitude of the information she had received. David knew that Gabriel was his son. Eduardo had orchestrated her meeting with David. Emily was his daughter, supposedly dead for 24 years. Each truth that emerged only revealed deeper layers of manipulation and lies. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Sarah, it's Mrs. Hiroko. May I come in?" Sarah opened the door to find the retired nurse carrying a tray with tea and cookies, but her expression was more serious than usual. "Aunt Carol told me you returned yesterday quite shaken," Mrs. Hiroko said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Did something happen at work with Dr. Thompson?" The mention of David's name made Sarah feel a pang of pain in her chest. How could she explain that the man she had begun to trust, perhaps even love, had known from the beginning that Gabriel was his son? "Mrs. Hiroko," Sarah said slowly, "can I trust you completely?" even if what I say is complicated. Sarah, during my 40 years as a nurse, I've heard more secrets than most priests. Your privacy is safe with me. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her everything. The DNA test results, Eduardo's suspicious offer, the meeting with Emily, and the devastating revelations about her true identity and David. Mrs. Hiroko listened in silence, occasionally nodding or frowning, but without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the room fell silent for several minutes. "Sarah," Mrs. Hiroko finally said, "there are some things I need to tell you, things that might shed a different light on this situation." "What do you mean?" "First, about Dr. Thompson. He is not just an ordinary pediatrician. Before specializing in pediatrics, he worked for 2 years at the General Hospital in forensic medicine. He has experience in medical investigations." Sarah felt a chill in her stomach. "And what does that mean?" "It means he has skills to obtain information that ordinary doctors wouldn't have, including access to old hospital records." "Do you think he investigated my past?" "It's possible. But Sarah, there's something more. Dr. Thompson approached me last week asking questions about you, specific questions about your family, about Gabriel, about your legal situation." The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in on Sarah. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know if you had mentioned anything about Gabriel's father, if you had shown romantic interest in anyone, if you seemed to be hiding something." "Did he ask you to spy on me?" "Not exactly." Mrs. Hiroko paused, choosing her words carefully. "But the impression I got was of someone who already knew more about you than a recent employer should." Gabriel woke up at that moment, making small sounds that demanded attention. Sarah picked him up automatically, her movements mechanical, as her mind processed the implications of what Mrs. Hiroko had just revealed. "Sarah, may I suggest something?" "What?" "That you confront Dr. Thompson directly, but not alone, and not in his office. In a public place where you have control of the situation. And if he lies, then you'll know you can't trust him. But if he tells the truth, you might find that things aren't exactly as they seem." 2 hours later, Sarah found herself sitting in a cafe on Main Street, with Gabriel in the stroller beside her, waiting for David to arrive. She had sent a simple message: "We need to talk. Urgent. I have information about Gabriel that you need to know." David arrived 15 minutes later, clearly having run from the hospital. His hair was disheveled, and there was a coffee stain on his white shirt. When his eyes met Sarah's, she immediately saw that he knew she had discovered something important. "Sarah," he said, sitting down in the opposite chair, "from your tone in the message, I assume this is about paternity." The frankness of the statement caught her off guard. "So you already know?" "Know what? Specifically?" "That Gabriel is your son." David froze completely for a moment, his eyes studying Sarah's face as if trying to read her intentions. "How did you find out?" "Does it matter? What matters is how long you've known." David leaned back in his chair, running his hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah had begun to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "Since the first time I held him," he admitted. "There are certain genetic traits that are unmistakable to someone with my background. The eye color, the reflexes, some specific birthmarks. And you didn't say anything." "What should I have said, Sarah?" "Hello? I'm your son's pediatrician, and by the way, I'm also his father because you slept with me once after a fight with your husband." The directness of his statement. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "You could have given me hints. Let me discover it naturally." "I thought about doing that, but then I started to wonder why you hadn't told me about the pregnancy in the first place. Because I didn't know if it was yours or David's. Because that night was a mistake I wanted to forget. Because my marriage was falling apart and I didn't want to complicate. Things further. Sarah's outburst made some people in the cafe turn to look. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. Sarah, that night wasn't a mistake for me. The declaration hit her like a bucket of cold water. What do you mean? Do you think it was a coincidence that I was at that bar in Brooklyn exactly when you were there? Do you think it was by chance that I offered to take you home? Sarah felt the world start to spin again. You were following me. Not exactly following, but Sarah, we already knew each other a long time ago. That's impossible. I would remember. Do you remember Dr. David, who treated you when you had pneumonia at 20? The intern who spent hours talking to you about literature while you were hospitalized? Memories came flooding back like an avalanche. The young doctor with dark hair who had sat beside her hospital bed, listening as she recited poems by Frost to pass the time. The same young man who had clearly been interested in her, but whom she had gently rejected because she was starting to date David. Oh my God, she whispered, you're that David. I never forgot. You, Sarah, for 15 years I always wondered how your life had turned out. And when my wife died and I was trying to rebuild my life, I decided to look for you. So, you knew about my marriage to David, my situation, and orchestrated our meeting at that bar. David shook his head. I didn't orchestrate our meeting, but when I found out you were there, alone and clearly suffering, I couldn't stay away. Ethan chose that moment to wake up, his dark eyes locking directly onto David, as if he could sense the tension between the adults. David, Sarah said slowly, you offered me a job knowing that Ethan was your son? I offered because you needed a job, because I needed a teacher, and because, he hesitated, because I wanted the chance to meet my son and the woman I could never forget. And if I had never discovered the truth, would you have let me think it was all coincidence forever? Sarah, I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. I wanted you to feel safe with me, to trust me, before revealing something that could change everything between us. Well, it has changed, Sarah said bitterly, because now I don't know who I can trust. David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Sarah, there's something you need to know. David isn't just a corrupt businessman, he's being investigated for human trafficking. The declaration hit her like a punch to the gut. What? His company was a front for a much larger operation. Emily wasn't the only child sold illegally. There's an entire network of fake adoptions, of babies sold to wealthy families, of forged documents. Sarah felt nauseous. How do you know this? Because for the last 3 years, since I started working with immigrant families, I've found at least 6 children with suspicious documentation, all connected to the same network of lawyers and businessmen, a network of which David is a central piece. And Emily? Emily is working as an informant for the FBI. Her approach to David wasn't personal revenge, Sarah. It was an operation to dismantle the network. The revelations piled up like waves, each one bigger than the last. Sarah held Ethan tighter, feeling as if he was the only real thing in a world that seemed entirely made of lies and manipulations. David, she finally said, if you knew all this from the beginning, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me go to that meeting yesterday without knowing the truth? Because Emily asked me to let her tell you first. She said you had the right to know about your daughter before knowing about the rest. You two are working together? We're all working to protect you and Ethan, and to ensure that David and his accomplices pay for what they've done. Sarah looked at David's face, searching for signs of deceit, but finding only a painful sincerity. David, how can I believe you? How can I trust that you're not manipulating me like everyone else? David reached across the table, gently touching Sarah's fingers. Because, Sarah, I love you. I loved you when I was 20, when you chose David. I loved you all those years I thought of you. And I love you now, even knowing that I may never earn your trust back. The tears Sarah had been holding back finally began to fall. Not tears of sadness this time, but of a complex emotion that mixed relief, fear, love, and the terrible realization that her life was about to change once again, in ways she couldn't foresee. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," David said softly, "you need to decide if you want to help put David in prison. Because, Sarah, you are the key to this entire operation, and they know it." Ethan made a small sound, as if agreeing with his father's words. Sarah looked at her son, then at David, and made a decision that would seal not only David's fate, but her own future, and that of her newly discovered family. "What do you need me to do?" Chapter 8. 2 weeks after the devastating conversation in the cafe, Sarah found herself in a situation she had never imagined living, wearing a tiny microphone hidden in her bra, preparing to record a conversation that could put the father of her daughter in prison. The apartment rented by the FBI in Midtown Manhattan had been transformed into an operations center, with agents monitoring electronic equipment while she prepared for the final meeting with David. "Remember, Sarah," said Agent Carla Smith, a woman in her 40s with tightly pinned black hair and eyes that had seen too many human atrocities. "Your safety is our priority. If the situation becomes dangerous, use the code word literature, and our team will intervene immediately." Sarah nodded, nervously adjusting the navy blue blazer she had chosen to look professional but not intimidating. Ethan was sleeping in the stroller next to the monitoring table, unaware that his mother was about to participate in a police operation that had begun 3 years before his birth. "And Emily?" Sarah asked. "Will she be there?" "Emily is positioning herself as planned. She will tell David that she discovered you are considering accepting his offer but want to negotiate the terms. This should make him confident enough to reveal details of the operation." David entered the room at that moment, wearing a dark suit that made him look more like a federal agent than a pediatrician. In the last 2 weeks, since Sarah had discovered the truth about her identity and Ethan, they had worked together to build the case against David, but the dynamic between them had completely changed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, approaching but keeping a respectful distance, something he had done since she discovered his true motivations. "Like I'm about to enter a thriller movie," Sarah replied, trying to inject lightness into her voice. "I never thought I would be a spy one day." "You don't have to do this, Sarah," David said for the 10th time. "We can find another way to gather evidence against him." "No, David, I need to do this." Sarah turned to face him directly. "David destroyed my life, sold my daughter, lied to me for a decade, and now I've discovered that there are other families, other children who have been separated from their mothers because of his greed. This needs to stop." Agent Smith checked the equipment one last time. "Sarah, the meeting is at his office in Upper East Side, right? Controlled environment, plenty of building security, multiple exits." "Yes. He said he wanted total privacy to discuss the final details of the offer." "And do you remember what you need to try to get him to confess?" Sarah took a deep breath, mentally reviewing the list she had memorized. "The source of the money he's offering, the names of others involved in the network, details about how the illegal adoptions were organized, and specifically about what happened to Emily when she was a baby." Sarah's phone rang. A message from David. "I'm already at the office. Can you come now?" "It's time," said Agent Smith. "Remember, our team will be 3/4 of a mile away. If there's any problem, shout the code word." Sarah kissed Ethan on the forehead, whispering, "Mommy will be back soon, my love." Then she turned to David, who was standing next to the stroller with an expression that mixed concern and something she couldn't identify. "David," she said impulsively, "after all this is over, we need to talk. About us, about Ethan, about the future." "I know," he replied softly. "But for now, just focus on getting back safely." David's office on Fifth Avenue was located on the 40th floor of a mirrored building, with a panoramic view of the city that Sarah had once found impressive. Now, as she waited for the elevator to arrive, all she could think about was how many families had been destroyed to pay for that view. David personally greeted her at the reception, something he had never done even when they were married. He wore his most expensive suit and had shaved carefully, but Sarah noticed that his eyes were slightly red and his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "Sarah, I'm glad you came," he said, formally kissing her on the cheek as if they were polite strangers. "How is Ethan?" "Well, growing fast." "Great. Shall we go to my office? We have a lot to discuss." David's office was exactly as Sarah remembered. Brown leather furniture, a bookshelf filled with books he never read, and expensive travel photographs scattered across the walls. There was a wedding photo of her and David on the desk, which surprised her. She had thought he would have removed it months ago. "Coffee? Water?" David offered, heading to the private bar that occupied a corner of the room. "I'm fine, thank you." Sarah sat in the leather chair he indicated, trying to appear relaxed while ensuring the microphone was positioned correctly. "So," David settled into the opposite chair, "Emily told me you're interested in my offer but want to discuss some details." "That's true. 2 million is a generous amount, David, but I want to understand where that money is coming from, especially considering the problems you mentioned with the company." David smiled, but Sarah noticed that the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, I've always admired your analytical mind. It's a fair question." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "The truth is that the textile company has always been just a small part of my business. I have other sources of income." "What kind of sources?" "Consulting services, facilitating complex legal processes, international connections that allow certain types of transactions." Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline. He was being evasive, but he was talking. "What kind of transactions?" David turned to face her, and for a moment Sarah saw something dangerous in his eyes. "Sarah, do you really want to know? Because once you know, there's no turning back." "I want to know." David returned to his chair, leaning forward. "There are very wealthy families in this country, Sarah. Families that want children, but for various reasons. They cannot have them through traditional channels. And there are young women, usually from poor families, who get pregnant without the means to raise the children." Sarah felt a chill in her stomach, but forced her voice to remain neutral. "And you facilitate the connection between these parties?" "Exactly. It's actually a humanitarian service. Children who would have grown up in poverty find loving families and endless resources. And the biological mothers? They receive generous compensation and the peace of mind, knowing their children will have better lives than they could provide." Sarah had to struggle not to vomit. "How long have you been doing this, David?" "About 15 years. It started small, a few connections here and there, but it has grown significantly in recent years." "And Emily? Is she involved in this?" David laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Sarah, Emily is much more than she seems. She has a natural talent for identifying opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" "Young women in vulnerable situations. Pregnant, teenagers, wives in unhappy marriages with limited resources." David paused, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Women like you were at 16. The statement hit Sarah like a punch. "What do you mean?" "Sarah, do you think it was a coincidence that your parents arranged that private adoption? Do you think it was by chance they received enough money to pay for your college expenses shortly after?" The world began to spin around Sarah. "Did you know my parents?" "I met them through a mutual acquaintance, a lawyer who specialized in facilitating this kind of transaction. David leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the shock on her face. Sarah, I knew about Emily since she was a baby. I kept discreet contact with the adoptive family, and when she grew up and started searching for her biological mother, I was the one who guided that search. You orchestrated everything? Orchestrated is a strong word. Let's say I facilitated certain confluences. Sarah felt nauseous. Why? Why do this? Because, Sarah, you have always been special. Even at 16, there was something about you that fascinated me. When I found you at university a few years later, I knew I wanted you in my life. You stalked me? I fell in love with you. And over the years, when I realized you were drifting away, that our marriage was in trouble, I decided to use the available resources to try to save our relationship. Sarah felt a cold rage growing inside her. What resources? Emily, she was instructed to get close to you, to understand why you were unhappy, to provide me with information that would help me be a better husband. But then, why did she become your mistress? David smiled, and this time the smile was genuinely amused. Because my dear stepdaughter is much smarter than I had anticipated. She decided to play her own game. The word stepdaughter echoed in Sarah's mind. What? Sarah, don't you understand yet? Emily is not just your daughter. After I married you, I legally adopted her. She is my daughter too, at least on paper. Sarah felt as if she were falling into a bottomless pit. Each revelation opened new layers of horror and manipulation. David, she said with a trembling voice, Ethan, you always knew he wasn't yours? Of course I knew. Sarah, I had Dr. David approach you. The final statement was like a bomb exploding. Sarah felt her entire world collapse again. What? Dr. David Thompson didn't find you by chance at that pub, Sarah. I hired him to seduce you, to give me legal grounds for divorce, and to ensure you had a child I could use as leverage. That is impossible. Sarah, do you think a respected doctor just decides to go to a pub in Brooklyn on the same night that an unhappy client's wife is there? Do you think it was a coincidence that he offered you a job exactly when you were desperate? Sarah tried to process the information, but her mind refused to accept it. David works for you? He did, temporarily. But as I said, people in this operation tend to be smarter than I initially predict. David stood up and walked to the table, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick folder. Sarah, this folder contains contracts from at least 20 families who bought babies through my network in the last 5 years. It includes photographs, forged documents, and payment records. It's worth approximately $50 million in operations. He placed the folder on the table between them. It also contains detailed records of the operation that separated you from Emily, including payments made to your parents and the hospital. And it contains evidence that Dr. David Thompson was paid $200,000 to get close to you and ensure you became pregnant. Sarah looked at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand that everyone around you, Sarah, all the people you trust, have been bought by me. And now I'm offering you the chance to join them voluntarily instead of discovering the truth, the hard way. What truth? David opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. The first showed Dr. David entering and exiting a bank, clearly receiving payments. The next showed Emily in meetings with men Sarah didn't recognize. And the last photograph showed Sarah and Dr. David at the coffee shop 2 weeks ago, but taken from an angle that suggested she was willingly passing information to him. Sarah, David said softly, you are being investigated by the FBI as an accomplice in a human trafficking operation. Dr. David and Emily are cooperating with authorities to reduce their own sentences. And you're about to become the only person without a plea deal. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Everything was collapsing again, but this time in a way that she didn't. There was no way this could be true. Sarah, you have used the word literature exactly 3 times since you got here. Isn't it interesting how certain words tend to repeat when we are nervous? Sarah's blood ran cold. He knew about the microphone. He knew about the police operation. David, Sarah, I know about Agent Smith. I know about the apartment in Midtown Manhattan. I know about the microphone you are using right now. He smiled. And I know that David and Ethan are there, waiting to hear this conversation. David turned to the window and waved down, as if greeting someone on the street. In fact, they are probably already on their way, because Sarah, what you don't know is that this entire conversation has been a setup. You are not recording evidence against me. You are being recorded confessing your voluntary participation in a child trafficking network. Sarah stood up from the chair, her legs trembling. I need to leave. Of course you do. But Sarah, before you go, I want you to understand one thing. Ethan is not in danger. Emily is not in danger. David is not in danger. The only person in danger here is you. David opened the door to the room, gesturing for her to leave. And Sarah, when you get to that apartment and find it empty, when you realize that David has disappeared with Ethan, when you understand that Emily has been a double agent from the start, remember that I offered an easy way out. $2 million and a new life far away from all this. Sarah ran down the hall, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. As she waited for the elevator, one question echoed in her mind. If David was right, if David had been hired to seduce her, if Emily was playing a double game, then where was Ethan now? And more importantly, who could she trust in a world where all truths turned out to be carefully constructed lies? The elevator arrived, and Sarah stepped in, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor as she prepared to find out if her life had been saved or irrevocably destroyed in the last 2 hours. Chapter 9. The apartment in Midtown Manhattan was empty. Sarah opened the door with the key that Agent Smith had given her 3 hours earlier and found only furniture covered with white sheets and the smell of fresh paint. There were no surveillance equipment, no federal agents, and more terrifying than anything, no sign of Ethan or David. Her hands trembled as she dialed David's number, listening to the phone ring incessantly until it went to voicemail. She tried Emily, same result. Agent Smith? The number did not exist. Sarah let herself slide down the wall until she sat on the floor, the reality of the situation hitting her with full force. David had orchestrated everything. The police operation had been fake. David had disappeared with Ethan. And she was completely alone. Her phone rang. An unknown number. Sarah. The voice was Mrs. Hiroko's, but there was an urgency in it that Sarah had never heard before. Where are you? You need to come home now. Mrs. Hiroko, is Ethan with you? There's no time to explain over the phone. Come to the boarding house. Immediately. Sarah ran through the streets of Midtown Manhattan to Chinatown like she had never run before, her mind creating increasingly terrifying scenarios about what could have happened to her son. When she arrived at the Hope boarding house, she found Mrs. Hiroko waiting for her at the entrance with a serious expression. "Where is Ethan?" Sarah asked before she even got close. "Safe. But Sarah, there are people here that you need to meet. People who will explain what is really going on." Mrs. Hiroko led her to the common living room of the boarding house, where Sarah found 3 people waiting. A woman in her 50s wearing a business suit, an older man with grey hair, and to her complete surprise, David. "Sarah," David immediately stood up. "Before you say anything, Ethan is safe. He is in my office with a trusted nurse." "You lied to me," Sarah exploded. "David told me everything about how you were paid to get close to me, about how this entire police operation was fake." "Sarah," the woman in the suit stood up, extending an official identification. "My name is Federal Agent Anna Smith, and I can assure you that the operation is very real." Sarah looked at the identification, then at the agent's face, but the apartment was empty. "Because we moved the operation at the last minute," explained the grey-haired man, who introduced himself as Federal Agent Robert Smith. "We received information that David had discovered our investigation. We had to improvise." "And Agent Smith?" "Doesn't exist," admitted Agent Smith. "It was a false identity we used to protect our real operation." Sarah felt dizzy. "So you were lying to me, too?" "Sarah," David approached carefully, "can I explain about the payments that David mentioned?" "Please," she said bitterly. "More lies? David really paid me $200,000, but not to seduce you." David took a deep breath. "He paid me to falsify medical reports that would prove that Ethan had health issues requiring expensive treatment and joint custody." Sarah stared at him. "What?" "His plan was to use Ethan's illness as an excuse to maintain control over you. If Ethan needed expensive treatments that only David could pay for, you would become dependent on him indefinitely. And you accepted the money." "I accepted it because it was the only way to infiltrate his operation. Sarah, I have been an undercover agent with the FBI for 2 years. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Hiroko, who gently addressed Sarah. "Sarah, there is one more person you need to meet." As if summoned, Emily entered the room. But the confident young woman Sarah had known had been replaced by someone visibly shaken, with red eyes from having cried recently. "Sarah," Emily said in a trembling voice, in the garden of the house in Brooklyn, Sarah Johnson became Sarah Morales in the presence of 30 people who represented the real life she had built from the ashes of her lost illusions. Ethan, now walking confidently, served as the ring-bearer, guided by David Jr., who had taken on the role of older brother with endearing seriousness. Emily was the maid of honor, radiant in a blue dress that highlighted the eyes she had inherited from her mother. Mrs. Hiroko and Carol cried throughout the ceremony, and even some of the colleagues from the FBI who had worked on the case attended to celebrate. The judge who officiated the ceremony remarked that in 40 years of career, he had rarely seen a couple look at each other with such depth of understanding and mutual acceptance. "Usually," he said during the reception, "people marry hoping their partner will change or fearing they will change. You married knowing exactly who the other is, including the difficult parts. That is rare and precious." During the first dance, as David spun her slowly in the garden adorned with fairy lights and jacaranda flowers, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Do you regret anything?" David asked, as if he could read her thoughts. Sarah thought for a moment, watching Ethan in Emily's arms, David Jr. trying to teach Mrs. Hiroko to dance, Carol animatedly chatting with David's colleagues. "No," she finally said. "Not even the bad parts, because the bad parts brought me to you, to Ethan, to Emily. They brought me to this life." "And now?" "Now," Sarah said, smiling as David kissed her under the stars of New York, "now we live happily ever after. Not in the fairy tale way, where everything is perfect, but in the real way, where we choose to be happy every day." Ethan chose that moment to escape from Emily's arms and stumble over to his parents, his little hands reaching out to be included in the embrace. David picked him up, and the three of them stood together as the music continued and their family danced around them. Sarah looked up at the starry sky and made a silent promise that she would always remember that true happiness does not come from perfect circumstances, but from imperfect people choosing to love each other through real circumstances. And then, surrounded by the love she had earned through the courage to face the truth, Sarah Morales danced under the stars with her husband and son, finally knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, who she was and where she belonged. The story had begun with a broken woman carrying a baby to a law office. It was ending with a whole woman building a future based on truth, forgiveness, and the love she had learned to recognize and accept.